Imagine waking up tomorrow and everything you know is gone. No running water, no antibiotics, no electricity, no law that protects you simply because you exist. The year is 1340. The place is somewhere in the English countryside, and you are a peasant, which means, statistically, that is exactly what you would have been. You own nothing. Your lord owns the land beneath your feet, the grain you harvest, and in many legal senses, you. Your life expectancy hovers around 35 years. Not because everyone dies at 35, but because so many never make it past 5. The air smells of wood smoke, animal dung, and damp earth. There are no paved roads, no glass in the windows, no clock to tell you the hour. The sun dictates when you rise, the church bell dictates when you pray. This was not a momentary crisis or a rough patch in the story of progress. This was normal. For roughly 1,000 years, from the collapse of Rome in the 5th century to the stirrings of the Renaissance in the 15th, the vast majority of Europeans lived lives that would strike a modern observer as almost incomprehensibly hard. We call this era the Middle Ages, and we tend to imagine it through the lens of castles, knights, and grand cathedrals. The reality was profoundly different. To understand what survival meant in medieval Europe, we must first understand the system that governed every breath a person took. The feudal order was not merely an economic arrangement, it was a cosmology, a total vision of reality in which every human being occupied a fixed position ordained by God. The king sat at the top, beneath only the Pope and the Almighty. Below the king came the great lords and barons, then the lesser knights and landholders, then the clergy in their own parallel hierarchy. And at the bottom, vast, silent, and essential, the peasantry, roughly 80 to 90% of the entire population. Your position in this hierarchy was not a starting point. It was a verdict. If you were born a serf in 1250 in rural France, you would almost certainly die a serf in rural France. Social mobility, as we understand it, did not exist. The lord of the manor held legal authority over your labor, your movement, your marriage. In many regions, a serf could not leave the estate without permission. A serf could not marry without the lord's consent. A serf could not even grind grain except at the lord's mill, for a fee. Freedom was measured in distance, and most people never traveled more than 15 miles from the place of their birth. But the feudal system was not pure oppression. It was a bargain, and understanding this bargain is essential. In exchange for labor, the lord owed protection. In an era of constant low-level warfare, banditry, and raiding, that protection was not abstract. It was survival itself. A peasant without a lord was a peasant without walls, without armed men, without legal standing. The system held because the alternative was worse. And the institution that sanctified this arrangement, that made obedience feel not like submission, but like virtue, was the church. The medieval Catholic Church was the single most powerful institution in Europe. It controlled vast tracts of land. In England alone, the church owned roughly a quarter of all arable territory. It ran the only schools. It operated the only hospitals. It maintained the only written records. Bishops wielded political power, rivaling that of dukes. Monasteries functioned as the era's banks, libraries, and agricultural research centers. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of the year: when to plant, when to rest, when to feast, when to fast. For a peasant in the 13th century, the local parish was not merely a place of worship. It was the government, the hospital, the news service, and the entertainment, all compressed into a single stone building. And yet, woven into this grandeur was something fragile. The entire system rested on the assumption that God had designed this order, that plague and famine were divine will, and that questioning the hierarchy was not just illegal, but sinful. When the cracks came, and they came, the entire edifice would shudder. But before the cracks came, there were ordinary days, and survival, in medieval terms, was a daily negotiation with forces that a modern person would find relentless. So, let us step inside one of those days. A working day in late spring, somewhere in England, around the year 1300, and see what it actually took to stay alive. You rise before dawn. There is no alarm, just the cold. The house, if we can call it that, is a single room shared with your family, and, in winter, with the livestock. The walls are wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The floor is packed earth, often damp, sometimes muddy. The only source of heat is a central hearth with no chimney. The smoke escapes, or doesn't, through a hole in the thatched roof. Your eyes sting constantly. Chronic respiratory disease is nearly universal among the rural poor. You have been coughing since childhood, and you will cough until you die. Breakfast, if it exists at all. Ani is a piece of bread made from coarse rye or barley, not the soft wheat bread of the Lord's table. Perhaps a cup of thin ale, which even children drink because the water is often unsafe. Then you walk to the fields. The work is not merely hard, it is unrelenting. The medieval peasant did not farm for profit. The peasant farmed to not die. Under the feudal system, a serf typically owed 2 or 3 days of labor per week to the lord's domain, his personal fields. The remaining days could be spent on the serf's own strip of land, growing food for the family. But even that harvest was not entirely the serf's. A portion, the tithe, went to the church. Another portion might go to the Lord as rent. What remained had to last through winter, through drought, through every bad season between now and the next harvest. The staple crop was grain, wheat for the wealthy, rye and barley for everyone else. Oats in the north. Meat was rare. A peasant family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but cattle were expensive, and hunting was reserved for the aristocracy. Poaching a deer from the Lord's forest was a crime punishable by blinding, mutilation, or death. The diet was monotonous: bread, pottage, a thick vegetable soup, and ale. Day after day, month after month, year after year. Nutritional deficiency was endemic. Scurvy, rickets, or an iron deficiency anemia left their marks on nearly every skeleton archaeologists have recovered from medieval peasant graves. And then there was the weather. A single wet summer could destroy the harvest. A late frost could kill the seedlings. Between 1315 and 1317, a catastrophe known as the Great Famine struck northern Europe. Torrential rains fell for months. Crops rotted in the fields. Grain prices in England rose by 300%. In some regions, people ate bark, roots, and, according to multiple contemporary sources, each other. An estimated 10 to 15% of the population died. This was not ancient history. This was 4 generations before Columbus. If the food did not kill you, the diseases might. Medieval medicine operated on a framework inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen, the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was understood as an imbalance among these fluids. The treatment was to restore balance, which usually meant bloodletting, purging, or the application of substances that a modern pharmacologist would recognize as either useless or actively poisonous. Surgeons existed, but surgery without anesthesia, antiseptic, or any understanding of infection was a last resort. A battlefield amputation was performed with a saw and cauterized with boiling oil or a heated iron. The patient was held down by assistants. Survival rates were low. Even a minor wound, a cut from a tool, a scrape from a fall, could become infected and turn fatal within days. Sepsis was invisible, unnamed, and everywhere. Teeth rotted without repair. Eyesight failed without correction. Hernias, broken bones improperly set, chronic pain from repetitive agricultural labor. These were not conditions to be treated. They were conditions to be endured. Women faced the additional danger of childbirth, which killed roughly 1 in every 40 mothers, a figure that, across a lifetime of multiple pregnancies, made death in labor a genuine probability rather than a remote risk. Then there were the epidemics. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and leprosy haunted the medieval world long before the Black Death arrived in 1347. Leprosy alone was so feared that the afflicted were declared legally dead, stripped of their property, and banished to isolated colonies. Church bells would ring the leper's funeral while the patient still breathed. The disease did not always kill, but the social death was absolute. The medieval village was, by modern standards, astonishingly unsanitary. Human and animal waste mixed openly in the streets, where streets existed at all. In towns, butchers dumped offal into open gutters. Tanners, whose work required soaking hides in vats of urine and animal brains, is concentrated in districts that even contemporaries described as unbearable. London's Fleet River, which ran through the heart of the city, was so choked with waste by the 14th century that it could barely flow. Inside the home, hygiene was limited by what was available. Soap existed but was expensive. Bathing happened less frequently than popular myth suggests. Not because medieval people were indifferent to cleanliness, but because heating enough water for a bath required fuel that most families could not spare. Lice were universal, fleas were constant. The straw bedding that covered most floors harbored insects, rodents, and mold. A modern health inspector would condemn the average medieval dwelling in seconds. Fire was the other constant threat. In a world built almost entirely of wood, thatch, and straw, fire moved with terrifying speed. London burned repeatedly, most famously in 1212. When a blaze on the south end of London Bridge trapped crowds on both sides and killed an estimated 3,000 people. In villages, a single overturned candle or a spark from the hearth could consume an entire row of houses in minutes. There was no fire brigade. There was only the bucket chain and the wind. Medieval Europe was a violent world, and the violence was not confined to warfare. Homicide rates in 13th century England were, by modern estimates, and somewhere between 20 and 40 times higher than in contemporary Britain. Men carried knives as a matter of course. Disputes over land, livestock, debts, and honor escalated into bloodshed with a frequency that would alarm a modern criminologist. The medieval concept of justice did not center on rehabilitation or deterrence in any modern sense. It centered on spectacle. Punishments were public and physical. Theft could cost you a hand. Repeated offenses could cost your ears, your eyes, or your life. Hanging was the standard execution for commoners, performed in the town square, often on market day with maximum visibility. For more serious crimes, treason, heresy, counterfeiting, the punishments escalated to burning, drawing, and quartering, or boiling alive. These were not aberrations, they were policy. The logic was explicit. Justice must be seen to be done, and the body of the criminal was the medium through which the message was delivered. For women, and the system was particularly unforgiving. A woman accused of being a scold, speaking too loudly, arguing with neighbors, or contradicting her husband, could be sentenced to the cucking stool, a chair mounted on a beam that dunked the offender into a river or pond. Accusations of witchcraft, which accelerated toward the end of the medieval period, could lead to torture and execution on evidence that amounted to nothing more than a neighbor's suspicion. Trial by ordeal, carrying a hot iron, and plunging a hand into boiling water, persisted into the 13th century as a genuine legal mechanism. The theory was that God would protect the innocent by healing their wounds within 3 days. If the burn festered, guilt was proven. The church eventually banned the practice in 1215, but it lingered in custom long after the formal prohibition. If the physical hardships of medieval life were relentless, the psychological landscape was no less extreme. The average medieval person lived within a framework of belief that is almost impossible for a secular modern mind to fully reconstruct. God was not a metaphor. Hell was not a concept. They were realities, as immediate and tangible as the mud on the road. The church taught that the world was a brief, painful test, and that the only thing that truly mattered was the fate of the soul after death. Earthly suffering was not merely expected, it was theologically necessary. This belief system shaped every aspect of daily life. The calendar revolved around saints' days, feast days, and liturgical seasons. A medieval worker had, by some estimates, more days off per year than a modern American. But those days were structured around religious observance, not leisure. Carnival before Lent was a period of intense celebration, precisely because it preceded 40 days of mandatory fasting and penance. Christmas lasted 12 days, but Easter was preceded by weeks of somber reflection. Time itself was not measured in hours and minutes, but in the intervals between prayer. For those who transgressed, or were accused of transgressing, the church's power was absolute. Excommunication severed a person not merely from the sacraments, but from the entire social fabric. An excommunicated individual could not conduct business, could not testify in court, could not receive a Christian burial. And in a world where the church was the sole gatekeeper of both spiritual and social legitimacy, excommunication was a form of civil death. And yet, And this is the paradox that makes the medieval world so fascinating. The church also preserved what remained of learning, of art, of intellectual inquiry. Monks copied manuscripts that kept classical knowledge alive through centuries of disruption. Cathedral schools laid the foundations for the first universities. The same institution that burned heretics also produced Thomas Aquinas, who argued that reason and faith were not enemies but partners. The medieval church was, simultaneously, the greatest force for intellectual preservation and the greatest force for intellectual suppression in European history. Given all of this, the backbreaking labor, the disease, the violence, the rigid hierarchy, the ever-present threat of famine and fire, a modern person might reasonably ask, how did anyone endure it? The answer is that they did not experience their lives as we imagine them. Hardship that is universal is not perceived as hardship. It is perceived as reality. Medieval people laughed, loved, celebrated, competed, and created. Village festivals brought music, dancing, and games. Wrestling matches, archery contests, football played with a pig's bladder across entire parishes with rules so loose that injuries were common and enthusiasm was boundless. Alehouses served as the social centers of rural life. Stories were told, gossip exchanged, romances kindled. The medieval world was not devoid of joy. It was simply a world where joy existed alongside conditions that would terrify us. Craftsmanship offered another form of meaning: a skilled blacksmith, a master carpenter, a talented weaver. These were people whose work commanded respect and whose products could be objects of genuine beauty. The guild system, which governed urban trades from the 12th century onward, provided structure, standards, and a sense of professional identity that gave artisans a place in the world beyond mere survival. And there was the extraordinary explosion of art and architecture that the medieval period produced. The great cathedrals, Chartres, Notre Dame, Canterbury, Cologne, were not built by machines. They were built by human hands, over decades and sometimes centuries, made by communities that poured their collective aspiration into structures designed to make the divine visible on earth. A peasant who stepped inside Chartres Cathedral in 1250 saw something no modern experience quite replicates: a space engineered to produce awe, flooded with light filtered through glass that told the entire story of creation in color. Whatever else the medieval world was, it was not a world without transcendence. So, could you survive? The honest answer is probably not. And not because medieval people were tougher or more resilient in some genetic sense, but because survival in their world required a set of skills, tolerances, and psychological adaptations that modern life has made unnecessary. You would not know how to read the weather by the color of the sky, how to slaughter and preserve an animal, how to deliver a child without a hospital, how to endure a toothache for years without relief. More than that, yet you would not know how to accept, truly accept, that most of what happens to you is beyond your control, and that the proper response to suffering is not outrage, but endurance. The medieval world was a trade-off that most of its inhabitants never consciously chose. They traded freedom for protection, curiosity for certainty, comfort for survival. The system was brutal, hierarchical, and often deeply unjust, but it was also coherent. It offered a framework in which every pain had meaning, and every death had a destination, and every person, from the king to the serf, occupied a place in an order that extended from the mud to the stars. When that order finally cracked, when the Black Death killed a third of Europe and labor suddenly had bargaining power, when the printing press made knowledge ungovernable, when Luther nailed his theses to the door and the church's monopoly on truth began to dissolve, the world that emerged was freer, more dynamic, and more uncertain. Though we are the inheritors of that uncertainty, we gained autonomy, medicine, rights, comfort. We lost the thing the medieval world had in abundance: a complete and unquestioned story about why we are here. The next time you flip a light switch, take a painkiller, or open your refrigerator, you are performing an act that separates you from 1,000 years of human experience. The distance between us and the medieval world is not measured in centuries. It is measured in assumptions about safety, about comfort, about what a single life is worth. The mud has dried, the cathedrals still stand, and somewhere beneath the modern world,